what you can do. God of wonder, your power has no end. Things you've done before, greater measure, you will do again. 'Cause there's no prison wall you can break through, no mountain you can move. All things are possible. There's no broken body you can raise, no soul that you can save. All things are possible. The darkest night, you can light it up. You can light it up. God of revival, let hope arise. Death is overcome. You've already won. God of revival, rose in victory. Now you're seated ever on your throne. So why should my heart fear you defeated? I will trust in you alone. There's no prison wall you can break through, no mountain you can move. All things are possible. There's no broken body you can raise, no soul that you can save. All things are possible. The darkest night, you can light it up. You can light it up. God of revival, dead will rise. Death is overcome. You've already won. God of revival, God of revival. Come awaken your people. Come awaken the city. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. Chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Come awaken your people. Come awaken the city. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. The darkest night, you can light it up. You can light it up. God of revival, let hope arise. Death is overcome. You've already won. God of revival. Come awaken your people. Come awaken the city. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. Hear the chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Come awaken your people. Come awaken the city. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. prison wall you can't break through, no mountain you can't move. All things are possible. There's no broken body you can raise, no soul that you can't save. Things are possible. Things are possible.
Hello and welcome. My name is Pastor Dave. Thank you for joining us. We are kicking off this new series called Crushing Fear. I am super excited about this. This whole series we're going to be kind of based in the first chapter of the book of Joshua, and we're talking about crushing fear. And let's, right off the bat, I want to define fear a little bit. We're not talking about being afraid of like spiders or that 8-foot cobra that's hanging out behind your dryer. That's not the fear we're talking. We're talking about the fear that hinders us. We're talking about the fear that can be, it's like an uninvited guest that has stayed too long. The fear that is driving this epidemic of anxiety in our country. We're talking about the fear that is maybe peddled on the news. It can be economic fear. It can be political fear. It can be the fear of standing up to do the right thing. It can be a virus, right? Like there are certain things that the news may be telling us we should be afraid of this. This is really bad. This is going to be terrible. Those are the fears we're talking about. The fears that cause us to worry, that give us anxiety, that keep us awake. Those are the fears. And we must address it. We must talk about it. It's really becoming a bit of an epidemic, I believe. It is a major contributor to how decisions are made nowadays. William Shakespeare, because you got to have a good Shakespeare quote. He said that a coward dies 1,000 times before his death, but the valiant taste of death but once. It seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come. And Shakespeare knew something that fearing death, as he was talking about, is unnecessary because your fear will not prevent it. Your fear will not stop it. And in fact, I begin to wonder if fear is maybe a contributing factor to meeting our death, right? And so we must stand against it. As followers of Jesus, we must recognize that fear is not something we should put up with any longer. It's an uninvited guest that, quite frankly, it's time to kick out. See, fear is this thing that it's not just that God suggests, hey guys, don't be afraid. God commands, do not fear. And so we're gonna be addressing that. Joshua chapter 1, the book starts off like this. It says, after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun. So Moses, if you remember, he led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and then around in the wilderness for 40 years, and Moses was the leader. And now he's dead. And so his assistant, Joshua, is taking the leadership. He is the guy next in line. And so Moses, my servant, is dead. This is the Lord speaking to Joshua. Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore, the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan into the land I am giving them. So they have gone from Egypt. They're at the edge of the Jordan River, about ready to cross into the promised land. If you remember, God had promised this land to Abraham and had told Abraham, like, look, I know that you and your wife don't have any kids yet, but I'm promising you, I'm making a covenant with you, you are going to become a great nation. And I'm going to give you a land. And so we often call it the promised land. But it wasn't a land that was uninhabited. It was a land that had people in it. And these people were going to be forcibly relocated. And they're going to suffer the just punishment of their sins and of their rejection of God. And so don't confuse that. But the Israelites are going to have to do this thing. They're going to have to go in and take it. When the Lord said he's giving it to them, he is in one sense giving it to them, but they are also having to work for it. They're going to have to take courage and go in and do the things, right? And so they are on what I call the long road to the edge of promise. If you go back to the book of Numbers, chapter 13, the Israelites have left Egypt and they send these spies into the promised land. They're wanting to see, okay, what are we getting ourselves into? What does this look like? What does the land look like? What's there? Who is there? And so Numbers 13 tells us a story, and Moses sends 12 spies to go and explore the land, right? That makes sense. Well, they return after a number of days, and 10 of the spies feared. And their report was, look, the land is awesome. It's amazing. It's just what God said it would be, except the people there are big and strong and scary, and they have walled cities, and we can't possibly take it. They will kill us. And then 2 spies say, no, like, if God is with us, we can do this thing. Like, yes, they're big and scary and they have walled cities, but if God is with us, we do not have to be afraid. And the people listened to the 10 instead of the 2. And so the consequence of their fear was that God said, fine, you believe your fear over my promise? This whole generation is going to die in the desert. And their children will be the ones who will get the promised land. And so the reason that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, what should have been a short journey from Egypt into the promised land, it wasn't that the road was so long it took 40 years. It wasn't that it was summer road construction and they were just waiting and waiting and waiting for their turn to go on their lane. It wasn't that. It was that when they spied out the land to see what they were getting into, the 10 spies came back and they reported a report of fear, and the people believed it. And it says their hearts melted. And they were so afraid that they weren't going to be able to go in and take the land, that God said, you guys believed your own fear over my promise? You can die in the desert. See, fear has a heavy consequence. And so they wandered for 40 years until that generation died. And then it was their children who got the promise. And now they're at the edge of the Jordan River, about to cross into the promised land. And God is speaking to Joshua, their new leader. Moses has just died. They have mourned him. You can read it in Deuteronomy 34. And then God tells this to Joshua. Joshua 1:9, and this is a verse that we see often. It says, "This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid." And in the context of where they are at, this is the children of the people who wandered in the desert for 40 years because of fear. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And so God is telling Joshua, Moses is dead, and now it's your time to lead. And the time has come to lead without fear. And I believe God in turn is also telling that to us, that the time has come for us, the followers of him, to lead without fear. Paul Atreides, from a science fiction novel and an upcoming movie, has this mantra that is repeated, and he says, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total oblivion. And he's right. See, I think when we analyze fear and we look at it and we see the consequences of fear, I think one of the first things that I notice is that fear blurs vision. That when we fear, we are not seeing clearly. The Israelites were afraid and they couldn't see the promise because of that. And when we let fear creep into our minds and our hearts, it will blur our vision. And we will not see truth. We will not see the promises of God. We will not see the possibilities. Fear blurs vision. The next thing I notice about fear is that fear blockades growth. Right? God has called us into a holy life. God has called us into living without fear and leading without fear. And part of that process is this growing process where we become more and more like him, where we become unashamed of the gospel. But when we let fear creep into our minds, it blockades that growth. The Israelite nation, they were supposed to go from this ragtag group of ex-slaves into a nation with their own country. And instead, fear blockaded that growth for an entire generation. The next thing that I see is that fear poisons zeal. See, zeal is this excitement and this enthusiasm for a cause. But when fear creeps in, it poisons our zeal. And we no longer have this excitement for it. We no longer have this enthusiasm. Our zeal has been poisoned by fear. When we look at anxiety, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a professional counselor, but when I see people who struggle with anxiety and depression, I know a lot of those things are driven by fear. Fear of having to face this thing or to go through this hard thing again, or whatever it might be. And one of the results of that is I see that it poisons their zeal. And people who struggle with those things, and they lose enthusiasm for life, right? It's hard for them to get excited to go and do. The fear poisons their zeal. This other guy has this quote, and he says, "Fear is the bondage maker." Fear is the bondage maker. When we give in to fear, when we allow all of these outside voices, and right now in our culture there are a lot of outside voices, from social media to the nightly news to our coworkers, there are a lot of voices spreading fear. A lot of voices telling us how bad it's going to get, how bad this thing is, we're all going to die, right? There is all this fear being peddled, and it's creating bondage. We're becoming slaves to fear instead of having zeal for the promises of God. And we must move on from this. We must kick out that uninvited guest. It's time to lead without fear. And so how do we do that? How do we become a people who begin to lead like Joshua? How do we lead without fear? And I've got 3 areas that I'm going to look at for the next few minutes. See, I think to lead without fear, you must know your objectives. Joshua stood at the edge of the promised land, and he knew for him to lead without fear what he was going to have to do. He was going to have to cross the river, go in. They would face the enemies. They would go to war. They would march and do battle things, right? To lead without fear, you must know your objectives. I want to read to you from 1 Timothy. I remember your genuine faith. This is Paul writing to Timothy. Paul is in prison, and Timothy is one of his younger followers, and Paul has left Timothy in charge of a church, and Paul is writing to him to encourage him. And Paul, in prison, he can't do the things that Timothy is able to do. And so Paul is helping Timothy do the things that Paul himself can't. I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. So right off the bat, what do we see here? We see that Timothy is the grandchild and child of people of faith. And I think that gives us a clue as to one of our objectives. If we're going to lead without fear, what are we leading to? I think that we're supposed to lead our families to faith in Jesus. We're supposed to stand up and lead our families with truth on the foundation of the Gospels. Letting Jesus be the foundation of how we lead. This is why I remind you to fan into flames the spiritual gift God gave you when I laid my hands on you. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. So never be ashamed to tell others about our Lord, and don't be ashamed of me either, even though I'm a prisoner for him. With the strength God gives you, be ready to suffer with me for the sake of the good news. For God saved us and called us to live a holy life. He did this not because we deserved it, but because that was his plan from before the beginning of time, to show us his grace through Christ Jesus. And now he has made all of this plain to us by the appearing of Christ Jesus our Savior. He broke the power of death and illuminated the way to life and immortality through the good news. And God chose me to be a preacher, an apostle, and a teacher of this good news. That is why I am suffering here in prison. But I am not ashamed of it, for I know the one in whom I trust, and I am sure that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him until the day of his return. So what are our objectives? I think pulling from this section here, I think one of our objectives is to be like grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, to lead our families into a life of faith in Jesus. I think one of our objectives is also to lead our life as an example of holiness. He talks about that. How we stand in this culture that has become very unholy. And we are to stand up and lead by example what it is to follow Jesus and what it is to live a holy life. And I think we are supposed to also lead our culture and our communities to see Jesus in us and through us. And we must stand up for truth at times. We must quietly live our holy lives at times. We must be willing to suffer at times. Those are our objectives. We must not be ashamed of the gospel. We can speak up for life. We can speak up for truth. And if we suffer for it, we suffer alongside Paul and Jesus himself. That's your objective. No longer let fear tell you you can't stand up for truth. No longer let fear tell you that you can't lead your family to faith in Jesus. No longer let fear tell you that it's not right to object to the unholy culture. I think the second thing is to lead without fear. You need time in the tent. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me tell you. In Exodus, so you have Moses who led the people out of Israel and was the leader while they were in the wilderness. For those 40 some years, Moses was the leader, and Joshua at some point became Moses' assistant. And we get that from the first part of Joshua, the book of Joshua. You go back to Exodus 33, and you get this little story in there. It said it was Moses' practice to take the tent of meeting and set it up some distance from the camp. When they left Egypt, they had the tent of meeting in this makeshift temple where Moses would go and meet with God. Everyone who wanted to make a request of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside of the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent of meeting, all the people would get up and stand in the entrances of their own tents. They would all watch Moses until he disappeared inside. As he went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and hover at its entrance. While they were being led through the wilderness, God would appear as a cloud and also like it had fire and stuff. You can read the stories. The pillar of cloud would come down and hover at its entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. When the people saw the cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, they would stand and bow down in front of their own tents. Inside the tent of meeting, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Afterward, Moses would return to the camp, but the young man who assisted him, Joshua, son of Nun, would remain behind in the tent of meeting. Did you catch that? Moses would go and meet with God, and God would speak to Moses face to face. And Moses was going there on behalf of the people and on behalf of himself, trying to lead these people. And God would speak to him, and God would instruct and guide him. And then Moses would come out of the tent, and presumably he would go and report to the people what God had said. Joshua, his young assistant, would remain behind in the tent of meeting. See, if you want to crush fear in your life, and if you want to lead without fear, you need time in the tent. You need to spend time with God face to face. You need time in the tent. You will not crush fear on your own. And I think of just last night, we had a prayer meeting here at Restore. And it was like time in the tent. It was a handful of us spending time in the tent, in the prayer room we have just outside of the ballroom where we meet. It was time in the tent. And we were crushing fear. We were actually last night anticipating today. We were praying against the power of fear in our lives and in our culture. We were spending time in the tent because we understand that to lead without fear, we must do that. And lastly, to lead without fear, surround yourself with Calebs. Now, who's Caleb? And I plural that Caleb's, like there could be more of them in your life. So Caleb, if you go back to the story of the 12 spies being sent in to spy the land out, and 10 came back with the negative report and said it's too scary, there's walled cities, there are giants in the land, we can't do it. And 2 had a positive report, said, you know what? It's got big walls, it's got giants, it's scary, but we believe the promise of God is more powerful than the fear. And those 2 people were Joshua and Caleb. And so God said, because of the people's fear, all of you people, this whole generation, you're going to die in the desert. You didn't believe my promise. Instead, you listened to the voices of fear. And so it was the kids who would now be at the edge of the Jordan, ready to go in and take the land, except for two people who were older, Joshua and Caleb. So Joshua 14, we read this story. A delegation from the tribe of Judah, led by Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, came to Joshua at Gilgal. Caleb said to Joshua, "Remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me when we were at Kadesh Barnea? I was 40 years old when Moses, the son of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave an honest report, but my brothers who went with me frightened the people from entering the promised land. For my part, I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. So that day Moses solemnly promised, the land of Canaan on which you were just walking will be your grant of land, and that your descendants and that of your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well, as he promised, for all of these 45 years since Moses made this promise, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness. Today I am 85 years old. I'm as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey, and I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You'll remember that as scouts we found the descendants of Anak living there in great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land, just as the Lord has said." And so Caleb, now an old man, is still just as strong as he was when he was in his 40s, not as old. God has preserved him. He has lived without fear. And so if you want to lead without fear, surround yourself with Caleb. Surround yourself with people who will believe the promises of God despite the fear being peddled around them. Surround yourself with people who will say, if God is with me, I will drive them out of the land. If God is with me, I can do exactly what God has called me to do. Surround yourself with those people. It might mean that you have to turn off social media. It might mean that you have to turn off the news. But surround yourself with Caleb's. The time has come to lead without fear. Joshua 1:9. This is my command. God isn't giving us a suggestion. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. The time has come to lead without fear.